Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stepped into the dimly lit military bar near Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, her civilian clothes doing little to hide the confident bearing that came from years of elite training. The Anchor's Rest was packed with off-duty personnel from various branches, their voices mixing with classic rock music and the clink of beer bottles. Sarah had chosen this particular establishment because it was known for being a place where military folks could unwind without the usual formalities of base life. She made her way to the bar, noting the familiar mix of Navy, Marine, and Coast Guard uniforms scattered throughout the room. After 6 months of intense deployment in the Mediterranean, she was finally back on American soil and ready to decompress. The bartender, a grizzled former Marine with tattoos covering his forearms, nodded in recognition. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit military community, especially about someone with Sarah's unique qualifications. Sarah had joined the Navy 8 years ago with dreams of becoming a pilot, but fate had different plans. During her initial training, her exceptional marksmanship skills and tactical thinking caught the attention of special operations recruiters. What followed were years of grueling training that pushed her to limits she never knew existed. She became one of only a handful of women to successfully complete the rigorous selection process for naval special warfare units. Her specialty was precision operations, often involving high-risk reconnaissance missions in hostile territory. The call sign Viper 1 had been earned during a particularly dangerous mission in Eastern Europe, where her team had to extract a captured intelligence officer from a heavily fortified compound. Sarah's ability to remain motionless for hours in a sniper position, combined with her deadly accuracy, had saved not only the target but her entire 6-man team. The deployment she'd just returned from had been particularly challenging. Her unit had been tasked with gathering intelligence on arms trafficking networks operating between North Africa and Southern Europe. For months, she had operated in small teams, often going days without proper sleep or hot meals. The work was dangerous and thankless, conducted in the shadows where success was measured by missions completed without anyone ever knowing they'd been there. As she waited for her drink, Sarah reflected on how different her life had become from what she'd originally envisioned. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she'd been the daughter of a high school principal and a nurse. Her parents had encouraged her love of sports and outdoor activities, but they'd never imagined their daughter would end up in some of the world's most dangerous places, carrying out missions that would never make the evening news. The physical demands of her job had shaped her into someone barely recognizable from the college student who'd first walked into a Navy recruiter's office. At 5'6", she possessed a wiry strength that allowed her to carry heavy equipment for miles across difficult terrain. Her auburn hair was currently pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes held a sharpness that came from constantly assessing threats and opportunities. Sarah's training had taught her to read people quickly and accurately. It was a skill that had kept her alive in hostile environments, but it also made social situations more complex. She found herself automatically cataloging exit routes, identifying potential threats, and noting who was carrying weapons even in friendly environments like this bar. The bartender slid a beer across the polished wood surface. Sarah took a sip and allowed herself to relax slightly. She'd earned this moment of peace. The mission she'd just completed had resulted in the disruption of a major weapons smuggling operation, potentially saving countless lives. Her team had spent weeks gathering intelligence, tracking movements, and documenting evidence that would later be used by international law enforcement agencies. Looking around the bar, she noticed the typical mix of military personnel in various stages of their careers. There were young sailors fresh out of boot camp, their enthusiasm and nervousness evident in their animated conversations. Seasoned NCOs occupied the middle ground, sharing war stories and dispensing wisdom to anyone willing to listen. In the corners sat the quiet professionals, the ones whose job descriptions were classified and whose experiences couldn't be shared in casual conversation. Sarah fell into this last category, though few people would guess it by looking at her. She'd learned early in her career that blending in was often more valuable than standing out. Tonight, she just wanted to be another service member enjoying a drink after a long deployment. The bar's atmosphere was comfortable and familiar, filled with the easy camaraderie that existed among people who understood the unique challenges of military life. Conversations flowed around topics ranging from upcoming deployments to family back home. from complaints about military bureaucracy to debates about the best equipment for various missions. Sarah found herself thinking about her team members, wondering how they were adjusting to being back. Special operations created bonds that were difficult to explain to civilians. When your life depended on the person next to you, relationships developed that went beyond normal friendship. Her team had become her second family, and she missed the constant communication and shared purpose that defined their working relationship. The deployment had ended successfully, but like all missions, it had taken its toll. Sleep came less easily now, and crowds sometimes felt overwhelming after months of operating in small, tight-knit groups. Sarah had learned to manage these transitions, understanding that readjustment was part of the job and that time would help restore her equilibrium. As she sat at the bar, Sarah began planning her next few weeks of leave time. She wanted to visit her parents in Texas, catch up with old friends, and maybe take a camping trip in the mountains where she could enjoy solitude without the constant vigilance required in hostile territory. These periods of rest and reconnection were essential for maintaining the mental sharpness her job demanded. The ice in her beer glass clinked softly as she took another sip, the sound mixing with the ambient noise of the busy bar. For now she was content to simply sit and observe, enjoying the luxury of being in a place where the biggest threat was someone getting too drunk and starting an argument about sports teams. Commander Jake Thompson pushed through the crowded entrance of the Anchor's Rest, his dress blue uniform drawing respectful nods from the other patrons. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 15 years of naval service, most of it spent in the shadowy world of special operations. His broad shoulders and weathered hands told the story of countless missions in hostile environments, while his dark eyes held the kind of intensity that came from making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. Jake had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. After 8 months deployed with SEAL Team 6 in the Middle East, he was finally stateside and ready to unwind. The mission he'd just completed had been particularly grueling, involving counter-terrorism operations in a region where the line between ally and enemy shifted with political winds. His team had successfully eliminated several high-value targets, but the psychological toll of such work was something that never got easier. The bar was exactly what he needed, filled with fellow service members who understood the unique challenges of military life, without requiring explanations or justifications. Jake had specifically chosen the Anchor's Rest because it was known for its relaxed atmosphere and its unspoken rule that shop talk stayed at a minimum. Tonight he just wanted to be another sailor enjoying a drink. As he made his way toward the bar, Jake's trained eyes automatically scanned the room, cataloging faces and assessing the general mood. It was a habit ingrained by years of operating in environments where situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death. He noticed the usual mix of personnel from various branches and specialties, their off-duty demeanor a stark contrast to the rigid professionalism required during duty hours. The bartender, recognizing Jake's rank and the distinctive insignia that hinted at special operations background, nodded respectfully. Word traveled fast in the special operations community, and Jake's reputation preceded him. He'd earned his place among the elite through exceptional performance during the most challenging training programs the Navy had to offer, followed by years of successful missions in some of the world's most dangerous locations. Jake ordered a whiskey neat, preferring the smooth burn of good liquor after months of abstaining while deployed. As he waited for his drink, he found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him to this point. Unlike many of his peers who had always known they wanted military careers, Jake had initially planned to become a teacher. He'd completed his degree in history before a chance encounter with a Navy recruiter had changed everything. The recruiter had seen something in Jake that he hadn't recognized in himself: the potential for leadership under extreme circumstances and the mental toughness required for special operations. What followed had been years of intensive training that had pushed him beyond what he'd thought were his physical and mental limits. He'd learned to operate in Arctic conditions, desert environments, and urban warfare scenarios that most people only saw in movies. His first deployment had been an eye-opening experience, teaching him that real combat bore little resemblance to training exercises. The weight of responsibility for his team members' lives had been overwhelming at first, but gradually he developed the confidence and decision-making skills that made him an effective leader. Over the years, he'd led dozens of missions, each one adding to his experience and understanding of modern warfare. The whiskey arrived, and Jake took a careful sip, savoring the familiar taste of quality bourbon. He'd learned to appreciate good liquor during his travels, often finding himself in situations where a shared drink with local contacts could provide valuable intelligence. Tonight, however, the whiskey was purely for relaxation, a way to help his mind transition from the constant alertness required in combat zones to the relative peace of civilian surroundings. Jake's most recent deployment had been particularly challenging, involving operations against a terrorist network that had been planning attacks on American interests. His team had spent months gathering intelligence, tracking targets, and executing precision strikes that disrupted the organization's operational capacity. The work had been successful but emotionally draining, requiring him to make decisions that would affect not only his team but potentially thousands of innocent civilians. The psychological burden of such responsibility was something that Jake had learned to manage over the years, but it never became easy. He'd lost team members in the line of duty, experienced the guilt that came with survival when others didn't make it home, and witnessed the kind of human cruelty that made newspaper headlines pale in comparison. These experiences had shaped him into someone who valued the simple pleasures of peace and the company of people who understood the cost of freedom. Looking around the bar, Jake appreciated the diverse mix of military personnel, each with their own stories and experiences. He could identify the different specialties by subtle clues, the way they carried themselves, the particular type of fitness that came from specific training regimens, and the subtle confidence that marked those who had seen combat. It was a community bound together by shared understanding and mutual respect. The conversation around him flowed easily, covering topics ranging from upcoming transfers to family news, from complaints about military bureaucracy to debates about equipment and tactics. Jake found comfort in the familiar rhythms of military conversation, the shorthand communication that developed among people who had experienced similar challenges and responsibilities. As he sipped his whiskey, Jake began thinking about his plans for the coming weeks of leave. He wanted to visit his sister in Colorado, spend time outdoors away from urban environments, and maybe take a fishing trip where he could enjoy solitude without the constant pressure of operational planning. These periods of decompression were essential for maintaining the mental clarity his job demanded. The bar's atmosphere was helping him transition from the hypervigilance of combat operations to the more relaxed mindset, appropriate for peacetime activities. He could feel the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease as the familiar sounds of casual conversation and clinking glasses replaced the constant background noise of military communications and equipment that had filled his recent months. Jake raised his glass slightly in a silent toast to his team members, both those who had made it home safely and those who hadn't. It was a private ritual he'd developed over the years, a way of honoring the bonds forged in combat and acknowledging the price of the work they did. Tonight, he was grateful to be among the living, sharing space with fellow warriors who understood the weight of service without needing explanations. The evening crowd at the Anchor's Rest continued to grow as more off-duty personnel filtered in from the nearby base. Sarah had been nursing her beer for the better part of an hour, enjoying the rare luxury of solitude and observation, without the constant pressure of mission objectives. She'd noticed the SEAL commander when he entered, recognizing the bearing and confidence that marked someone from the special operations community. Their worlds often intersected in the shadowy realm of classified operations. Though direct interaction was less common, Jake had positioned himself a few stools down from Sarah, close enough that they were sharing the same section of the bar, but with enough distance to maintain the respectful space that military personnel typically afforded each other in social settings. Both were content to enjoy their drinks in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about recent experiences and future plans. The bartender moved efficiently between customers, his experienced eye noting which patrons needed attention and which preferred to be left alone. The steady flow of conversation around them created a comfortable backdrop, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter from groups sharing stories or celebrating successful completions of training programs. Sarah found herself studying the reflection in the mirror behind the bar, noting how different she looked from the young woman who had first enlisted. Years of specialized training and demanding missions had carved away any softness, leaving behind someone who was undeniably formidable, despite her relatively small stature. The transformation hadn't been just physical. Her entire worldview had been shaped by experiences that most people would find impossible to imagine. Her thoughts drifted to her most recent mission, which had involved weeks of surveillance in a hostile urban environment. The intelligence they'd gathered had been crucial for a larger operation, but the work had required her to maintain a cover identity, while living among people who would have killed her without hesitation if they'd discovered her true purpose. The psychological strain of such deep cover work was something that few people, even within the military, fully understood. Jake caught sight of Sarah's reflection in the same mirror, noting the alertness in her posture despite her casual appearance. Something about her bearing suggested special operations background, though he couldn't immediately place which unit or specialty. The military community was small enough that paths often crossed, and he found himself wondering if they'd worked in overlapping areas of operation. The bar's atmosphere remained convivial, with the easy camaraderie that developed among military personnel during off-duty hours. Conversations flowed around them, covering everything from complaints about military food to debates about the best equipment for various specialized tasks. Both Sarah and Jake found comfort in the familiar rhythms of military conversation, even when they weren't directly participating. A group of young sailors at a nearby table were engaged in an animated discussion about their upcoming deployment, their enthusiasm and nervousness evident in their rapid-fire questions and bold predictions about what they might encounter. Sarah smiled slightly, remembering her own early days when everything had seemed like an adventure waiting to happen. Experience had taught her that reality was often far more complex and demanding than any training could fully prepare someone. For Jake noticed Sarah's smile and found himself curious about what had prompted it. The expression had been brief but genuine, suggesting someone who had developed perspective through experience rather than cynicism through disappointment. It was a distinction he'd learned to recognize in fellow veterans, particularly those who had seen significant combat. The evening wore on with the comfortable pace of a military bar during peacetime, where the primary objectives were relaxation and the gradual transition from operational mindset to civilian normalcy. Both Sarah and Jake were masters of this transition, having learned through necessity how to compartmentalize their experiences and find peace in moments of safety. Sarah finished her beer and signaled the bartender for another, her movements economical and precise in the way that came from years of training, where wasted motion could mean failure or death. The bartender nodded and reached for a fresh bottle, his movements equally efficient as he served customers who understood the value of good service and appropriate gratuity. Jake found himself observing Sarah's interaction with the bartender, noting the mutual respect that was evident in their brief exchange. Military personnel often developed a particular appreciation for good service, having experienced situations where competence and reliability could mean the difference between mission, success, and catastrophic failure. The crowd around them continued to ebb and flow as some patrons left for other engagements while new arrivals took their places. The bar maintained its character as a gathering place for military personnel, with the unspoken understanding that rank and branch differences mattered less than shared understanding of service and sacrifice. A country music song began playing on the sound system, prompting several patrons to sing along with varying degrees of musical ability. The communal participation in familiar songs was another aspect of military culture that both Sarah and Jake found comforting, representing the bonds that transcended individual differences and united people around common experiences. Sarah's second beer arrived just as a particularly loud group at the far end of the bar erupted in laughter over someone's embarrassing training story. The sound was infectious, and even the more reserved patrons found themselves smiling at the obvious camaraderie being displayed. These moments of levity were precious in a profession that often dealt with life and death situations. Jake raised his glass slightly in response to the distant laughter, a gesture that Sarah noticed and appreciated. It was the kind of small acknowledgement that happened frequently among military personnel, a way of sharing positive moments without requiring direct interaction or conversation. The evening was progressing, exactly as both had hoped when they'd decided to visit the Anchor's Rest. The combination of familiar surroundings, understanding company, and quality drinks was providing the kind of decompression that couldn't be replicated in civilian establishments. Here, among people who shared similar experiences and challenges, They could relax in ways that weren't possible in other environments. Neither Sarah nor Jake was in any hurry to leave, both savoring the rare opportunity to simply exist without operational responsibilities or mission timelines. The bar represented a safe harbor where they could temporarily set aside the weight of their professional obligations and enjoy the simple pleasure of good company and quality drinks. The atmosphere in the Anchor's Rest shifted subtly as a group of young Marines entered, their boisterous energy adding a new dynamic to the evening's mix. They were clearly celebrating something, possibly a successful completion of training or an upcoming promotion, and their enthusiasm was infectious. The bartender greeted them with practiced efficiency. Having seen countless such celebrations over his years of service to the military community, Jake watched the Marines settle into a corner booth, their animated conversation carrying across the room despite their attempts to keep their voices down. He remembered his own early days in the Navy, when every accomplishment had felt monumental, and every challenge had seemed like an opportunity to prove himself. Experience had taught him that real confidence came from consistent performance under pressure rather than from individual achievements. Sarah observed the same group with a mixture of amusement and nostalgia. She'd once possessed that same unbridled optimism, before years of classified missions had taught her that success was often measured in operations that went unnoticed rather than achievements that could be celebrated publicly. The work she did now saved lives and protected national interests, but it rarely came with recognition or public acknowledgement. The conversation between the Marines grew more animated as they shared stories from their recent training exercises. Their tales of overcoming obstacles and pushing physical limits resonated throughout the bar, reminding everyone present of their own journeys through military training and development. These shared experiences created bonds that transcended branch rivalries and rank differences. Jake found himself thinking about his own team members, wondering how they were adjusting to being back stateside after their recent deployment. Special operations created relationships that were difficult to maintain during periods of separation, when the intense bonds forged in combat had to be sustained through occasional emails and rare phone calls. The transition from constant collaboration to individual leave time was always challenging. Sarah's thoughts followed a similar path, as she considered the unique challenges faced by women in special operations. She'd had to prove herself repeatedly, not just to earn her position but to maintain credibility with each new team and mission. The call sign Viper 1 had been hard-earned, representing not just her individual skills, but her ability to integrate seamlessly into units where failure could mean death for everyone involved. The bartender worked steadily through the growing crowd, his movements economical and practiced as he served drinks and managed the typical challenges of a busy military bar. His own service background was evident in the way he handled rowdy customers and maintained order without unnecessary confrontation. Veterans often gravitated toward establishments run by fellow veterans, appreciating the understanding that came from shared experience. A heated but friendly debate erupted at a nearby table between Navy and Air Force personnel about the relative merits of their respective branches. Such discussions were common in mixed military gatherings, serving as a way to maintain unit pride while acknowledging the contributions of other services. Both Sarah and Jake listened with amusement, having participated in countless similar debates throughout their careers. The evening continued with the comfortable rhythm that characterized successful military social gatherings. People moved between groups, sharing stories and catching up with acquaintances from previous assignments. The bar served as a neutral ground where the formal hierarchies of military structure could be temporarily relaxed in favor of the camaraderie that united people who had chosen to serve their country. Jake finished his whiskey and considered ordering another, weighing his desire to continue relaxing against his need to maintain the discipline that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous operations. He'd learned to appreciate alcohol in moderation, understanding that excessive drinking could compromise the physical and mental sharpness his job required. Sarah was facing a similar decision with her second beer, enjoying the rare opportunity to simply exist without operational pressures while remaining mindful of her professional obligations. She'd seen too many promising careers derailed by poor decisions during leave time to risk compromising her own position through careless behavior. The Marines in the corner booth had attracted a small audience as their celebration grew more elaborate. with other patrons drawn by their infectious enthusiasm and increasingly creative storytelling. The stories were growing taller with each telling, a tradition that stretched back through generations of military personnel who had used humor and exaggeration to process difficult experiences. Jake smiled at the Marine's performance, remembering his own early days when every training exercise had seemed like a life-changing adventure. He'd since learned that real adventure in military service often came disguised as routine missions that suddenly became anything but routine. The most memorable operations were usually the ones that went wrong in unexpected ways, requiring improvisation and teamwork to achieve successful outcomes. Sarah's attention was drawn to a quiet conversation between two older NCOs who were discussing the challenges of transitioning from active duty to civilian life. Their concerns about maintaining purpose and finding meaningful work after military service resonated with her own thoughts about the future. Special operations personnel faced unique challenges in translation of their skills to civilian careers, given the classified nature of much of their experience. The bar's sound system had shifted to classic rock, prompting several patrons to sing along with varying degrees of musical ability. The communal participation in familiar songs created a sense of unity that transcended individual differences, representing the shared culture that bound military personnel together, regardless of their specific roles or specialties. As the evening progressed, both Sarah and Jake found themselves settling into the comfortable routine of military social life. They were surrounded by people who understood the unique challenges and rewards of military service without requiring explanations or justifications. The bar provided a sanctuary where they could temporarily set aside their professional responsibilities and enjoy the simple pleasure of good company. The crowd continued to evolve as some patrons departed for other obligations while new arrivals took their places. The character of the Anchor's Rest remained consistent, serving as a gathering place where military personnel could find understanding, camaraderie, and the kind of relaxation that was difficult to achieve in civilian environments. The evening at the Anchor's Rest reached a natural lull as the dinner hour crowd began to thin out, leaving behind the more serious drinkers and those with nowhere urgent to be. The lighting seemed warmer somehow, and conversations had shifted from the animated discussions of earlier to more intimate exchanges between smaller groups. Both Sarah and Jake had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a military bar during its quieter hours. Jake had been nursing his second whiskey for the better part of an hour, savoring both the smooth liquor and the rare opportunity to simply observe without the constant pressure of leadership responsibilities. His eyes occasionally swept the room out of habit, but for once he was able to appreciate the view without cataloging potential threats or escape routes. The bar felt genuinely safe, filled with people who shared his understanding of service and sacrifice. Sarah had found herself engaged in brief conversations with other patrons throughout the evening, the kind of casual interactions that military personnel excelled at, regardless of branch or specialty. She'd exchanged pleasantries with a Coast Guard pilot about challenging weather conditions, shared a laugh with a Marine sergeant about the peculiarities of military food, and offered encouragement to a young sailor who was nervous about his upcoming deployment. The bartender had developed the efficient rhythm that came from years of experience, moving smoothly between customers while maintaining the perfect balance of attentiveness and discretion. He'd served everyone from fresh recruits celebrating their first weekend pass to seasoned veterans, marking significant career milestones, and he'd learned to read the mood of his clientele with remarkable accuracy. A sudden commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention as a group of pilots from the nearby air station made their entrance. They carried themselves with the particular swagger that came from flying high-performance aircraft, their conversation peppered with aviation terminology and good-natured rivalry about flying skills. Their presence added a new energy to the bar's atmosphere. Jake recognized several of the pilots from joint operations training exercises, where naval special operations teams had worked closely with aviation units to develop coordinated tactics. The relationships forged during such training were invaluable during actual operations, when split-second communication could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Sarah watched the pilots settle into their preferred section of the bar, noting their easy camaraderie and the confidence that came from mastering one of the military's most demanding specialties. She'd worked with similar units during her own operations, often relying on aviation support for insertion and extraction from hostile territory. The trust required for such operations created bonds that lasted far beyond individual missions. One of the younger Marines from the corner booth had apparently decided that the evening called for more ambitious entertainment. He'd convinced the bartender to turn up the music and was attempting to organize an impromptu karaoke session using a portable speaker someone had produced. His enthusiasm was infectious, though his singing ability left considerable room for improvement. The karaoke attempt prompted a mixture of encouragement and good-natured heckling from the other patrons, creating the kind of spontaneous entertainment that made military bars memorable. Several people volunteered to join in, while others were content to serve as an appreciative audience for the increasingly creative performances. Jake found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced in months, the combination of familiar surroundings and understanding company, allowing him to temporarily set aside the hypervigilance that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. The sound of laughter and casual conversation was a welcome change from the constant radio chatter and equipment noise that had filled his recent deployment. Sarah was experiencing a similar sense of relief, enjoying the rare opportunity to simply exist without the constant awareness of potential threats that characterized her professional life. The bar represented a sanctuary where she could appreciate the simple pleasure of human company without the complicated dynamics that often arose when her gender and specialty intersected in operational environments. The evening had reached the point where individual conversations were beginning to merge into larger group discussions. As the alcohol and comfortable atmosphere broke down the usual barriers between different branches and specialties, stories were being shared that would never be told in official settings, creating the kind of informal knowledge transfer that was invaluable for military effectiveness. A senior chief petty officer had begun telling a story about a training exercise that had gone spectacularly wrong, his animated description drawing laughter from everyone within earshot. The story involved multiple branches of service, complicated logistics, and the kind of creative problem-solving that military personnel developed through necessity. His storytelling ability was clearly honed through years of experience. Jake appreciated the senior chief's story, recognizing the underlying lessons about adaptability and teamwork that were being conveyed through humor and self-deprecation. The best military leaders understood the value of such informal education, using stories and examples to pass along wisdom that couldn't be captured in official manuals or training programs. Sarah found herself thinking about the stories she could tell if security classifications allowed, tales of missions that had required every ounce of training and experience she possessed. The nature of her work meant that most of her professional accomplishments would never be publicly acknowledged, but the satisfaction of successful missions and saved lives provided their own reward. The bartender had begun the subtle process of managing the evening's pace, ensuring that everyone remained safely within their limits while still enjoying the camaraderie that made the Anchor's Rest special. His experience with military clientele had taught him to recognize the signs of potential problems before they developed, allowing him to maintain order through gentle intervention rather than confrontation. As the evening progressed toward its later stages, both Sarah and Jake found themselves appreciating the unique culture of military social life. They were surrounded by people who understood the weight of responsibility that came with their chosen profession, but who also knew how to find joy and humor in circumstances that might overwhelm civilians. The bar served as a bridge between their professional identities and their personal needs for connection and relaxation. The evening at the Anchor's Rest had reached that perfect balance where conversations flowed easily and the barriers between strangers dissolved into the shared camaraderie of military service. Jake had been considering whether to order a third whiskey when he noticed that the attractive woman a few stools down had been nursing the same beer for quite some time. There was something about her bearing that suggested she was more than just another service member, and his curiosity finally got the better of his usual reserve. Jake shifted slightly in his seat, catching the bartender's attention with a subtle gesture that indicated he wanted to buy a drink for the woman down the bar. The bartender, experienced in facilitating such interactions among his military clientele, nodded understanding and approached Sarah with a fresh beer. When she looked up questioningly, he nodded toward Jake, who raised his glass in a casual salute. Sarah studied Jake for a moment, her trained eyes taking in the details that marked him as special operations. The way he carried himself, the unconscious alertness in his posture, and the particular type of fitness that came from specialized training all suggested someone from her community. She nodded her thanks and raised her fresh beer in acknowledgement, a gesture that Jake correctly interpreted as permission to approach. Jake picked up his drink and moved down the bar, settling onto the stool next to Sarah with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to making contact with potential allies in unfamiliar territory. The noise level in the bar provided enough cover for private conversation while still maintaining the comfortable atmosphere that had characterized the entire evening. Commander Jake Thompson, he introduced himself, extending his hand with the firm grip that was standard in military circles. His voice carried the authority that came from years of leadership in high-stress situations, but his tone remained friendly and casual, appropriate for the social setting. "Lieutenant Sarah Martinez," she replied, matching his firm handshake with one of her own. She'd learned early in her career that first impressions mattered enormously in military circles, and a weak handshake could undermine credibility before conversations even began. Her grip conveyed confidence without being aggressive, striking the balance that had served her well throughout her career. Jake's initial assessment of Sarah shifted as he processed her response. The combination of her bearing, fitness level, and the particular alertness he'd noticed suggested special operations background, which was unusual enough for female personnel that it immediately commanded his respect. He'd worked with enough elite units to recognize the signs of someone who had earned their position through exceptional performance. "What's your specialty?" Jake asked, the question serving both as casual conversation and professional curiosity. In the special operations community, understanding someone's background and capabilities was often essential for effective collaboration, even in social settings where such information might prove useful for future reference. Sarah hesitated for a moment, considering how much information to share with someone she'd just met. The nature of her work required careful consideration of operational security, but the setting and Jake's obvious military background suggested that general information would be appropriate. Her clearance level and specific missions would remain classified, but her basic specialty was a matter of record. "Precision operations," she replied carefully, using terminology that would be meaningful to someone with special operations background, while remaining appropriately vague about specific capabilities. The phrase could cover everything from sniper operations to technical intelligence gathering, allowing her to acknowledge her expertise without compromising sensitive information. Jake's interest sharpened immediately. Precision operations was a euphemism that covered some of the military's most demanding and dangerous specialties, requiring not only exceptional skill, but also the mental toughness to operate independently in hostile environments. The fact that Sarah had achieved such a position spoke volumes about her capabilities and dedication. "Impressive," Jake said, and meant it. He'd worked alongside precision specialists during numerous operations, understanding the critical role they played in mission success. The training required for such specialties was grueling, and the operational demands were extreme. Sarah's achievement represented years of dedication and exceptional performance under pressure. The conversation continued with the easy flow that developed between military professionals who recognized mutual competence and shared experience. They discussed general aspects of training and deployment without straying into classified territory, each appreciating the other's understanding of the unique challenges they faced in their respective roles. Jake found himself increasingly impressed by Sarah's intelligence and professionalism. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had proven herself repeatedly in demanding situations, but without the arrogance that sometimes characterized personnel who hadn't been tested under real pressure. Her responses demonstrated both technical knowledge and practical experience. Sarah was forming her own positive assessment of Jake, recognizing the leadership qualities that had obviously served him well throughout his career. His questions were thoughtful and demonstrated genuine interest in her perspective rather than the patronizing curiosity she sometimes encountered from male colleagues who couldn't quite believe in her capabilities. The bar around them continued to buzz with activity, but their conversation had created a pocket of focused interaction that allowed them to get to know each other without external distractions. Other patrons occasionally glanced their way, noting the obvious mutual interest and professional respect that was developing between them. As their conversation deepened, Jake decided to share more about his own background, describing his progression through various SEAL teams and the types of operations that had defined his career. He was careful to avoid classified details, but his stories painted a picture of someone who had successfully led teams through extremely dangerous missions. "What's your call sign?" Jake asked eventually, the question arising naturally from their discussion of operational procedures and team dynamics. Call signs were often revealing indicators of how someone had earned their reputation within the special operations community, representing memorable moments or defining characteristics that had impressed their peers. Sarah paused, her beer halfway to her lips, considering whether to share information that was somewhat more personal than the general background they'd been discussing. Call signs were earned rather than assigned, representing the respect and recognition of teammates who had witnessed exceptional performance under pressure. Hers carried particular significance given the circumstances under which she'd earned it. "Viper 1, she said finally, watching Jake's reaction carefully. The call sign represented one of the most significant moments of her career, a mission where her skills had not only ensured success, but had saved the lives of her entire team. It was a source of pride, but also a reminder of the weight of responsibility that came with her position." Jake's glass had been moving toward his mouth when Sarah spoke, but her words hit him like a physical blow. The whiskey tumbled from suddenly nerveless fingers, the glass hitting the bar with a sharp crack that drew surprised looks from nearby patrons. Amber liquid spread across the polished wood surface as Jake stared at Sarah with an expression of complete shock. "Viper 1? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The name was legendary in special operations circles, associated with a mission in Eastern Europe that had saved not only the intended target, but an entire 6-man SEAL team that had been compromised and facing certain death. Jake knew that story intimately because he had been the team leader whose life had been saved by the mysterious sniper, known only as Viper 1.